They say revenge is a dish best served cold, but sometimes it's best served in a custom-made Bentley with a glass of vintage champagne. Brucey invited his ex-wife Fiona to his wedding for one reason only: to humiliate her. He wanted her to see his wealth, his stunning young bride, and the empire he built after leaving her behind in the dirt. He expected her to show up in rags, looking miserable. He wanted her tears to be his wedding gift. But when the heavy iron gates of the estate swung open, it wasn't a taxi that pulled up. It was a sleek black stretch limousine. And when the door opened, the woman who stepped out wasn't the broken housewife he remembered. She was a nightmare, dressed like a daydream, and she held a secret that was about to turn Brucey's perfect day into a total catastrophe. You won't believe who she brought with her, and who actually owns the venue they are standing on. The envelope was heavy. Cream-colored textured cardstock with gold leaf trim. It looked like it cost more than Fiona used to spend on groceries for a month back in the bad days. Fiona Mitchell stood in the hallway of her penthouse apartment in downtown Chicago, flipping the envelope over in her hands. She knew that handwriting. It was jagged, rushed, and arrogant. Brucey. It had been 5 years. 5 years since Brucey Sterling had walked out of their cramped 2-bedroom rental, telling her she was stagnant. That was the word he used, stagnant. He told her he was destined for greatness. He was a rising star in the tech logistics world, and she, a substitute teacher who clipped coupons and wore thrift store sweaters, was an anchor dragging him down. He had left her with $400 in their joint account and a lease she couldn't afford. She tore open the seal. Mr. Brucey James Sterling and Miss Tiffany Blair Dubois. Request the honor of your presence at their marriage. Saturday, the 14th of October. The Vanderbilt Hall, Newport, Rhode Island. There was a handwritten note tucked inside on a smaller card. Fiona. I know things ended rough, but I'd love for you to see how far I've come. No hard feelings. Come have a free meal on me. I know you probably need it. H. Fiona stared at the note. Her blood ran cold, then hot. It wasn't an invitation. It was a summons to a public execution. He wanted her there as a prop. He wanted the contrast. He wanted his wealthy new business partners and his model-esque new fiancée to see the dowdy ex-wife so they could pat him on the back for upgrading. Bad news. Fiona looked up. Standing in the doorway of her kitchen was Richard. Richard wasn't just her partner. He was the CFO of Mitchell & Co., the boutique interior design and architectural firm Fiona had founded 3 years ago. You could say that, Fiona said, her voice steady, though her hand trembled slightly. She handed him the card. Richard read it, his eyebrows raising as he scanned the handwritten insult. He chuckled a deep, resonant sound. Brucey Sterling, the logistics guy. I saw his company's quarterly report. They're over-leveraged. He's inviting you to a wedding in Newport while his stock is down 12%. He thinks I'm poor Richard, Fiona said, walking over to the floor-to-ceiling window that overlooked the city skyline. He thinks I'm still the substitute teacher he left crying on the linoleum floor. He has no idea I started the firm. I kept my name off the press releases for a reason. So you're not going, Richard said, tossing the invite onto the marble counter. Fiona looked at her reflection in the glass. She didn't see the crying girl anymore. She saw a woman wearing a silk blouse that cost more than Brucey's first car. She saw a woman who had rebuilt herself from the ashes of his betrayal. No. Fiona smiled, a sharp, dangerous thing. I'm going, and I'm going to accept his offer of a free meal. But I think I need a +1. Are you busy that weekend? Richard grinned. For a front row seat to a train wreck, I'll clear my calendar. The decision was made. But Brucey wasn't just going to get a guest. He was going to get a lesson in humility. To understand why this invitation was so cruel, you have to understand the divorce. It hadn't just been a breakup. It had been a demolition. Brucey hadn't just left. He had secured a massive seed investment for his startup, Sterling Logistics, 2 days before asking for the divorce. He hid the assets. He claimed the company was worthless during the settlement proceedings. Fiona, heartbroken and unable to afford a forensic accountant, had signed the papers just to get him out of her life. She later found out he bought a Porsche the week the divorce was finalized. For 6 months, Fiona slept on her sister's couch. She worked 3 jobs. But in the quiet hours of the night, she started sketching. She had always had an eye for design, for transforming spaces. She started small staging houses for real estate agents. Then a minor celebrity in Chicago hired her to redo a condo. The photos went viral. Mitchell and Company was born. Now 5 years later, Fiona wasn't just comfortable. She was wealthy. Not flashy car wealthy, but generational wealthy. She had contracts with hotel chains in Dubai and luxury resorts in Aspen. But she kept a low profile. She didn't have social media. She let her work speak for itself. To Brucey, who only cared about the covers of Forbes or TechCrunch, she was invisible. The week before the wedding, Fiona flew to New York for a fitting. She wasn't going to a department store. She was going to see breathless designer Elise Vanya, a personal friend. "I need something that says mourning, but make it fashion," Fiona joked as she stepped onto the podium in Elise's studio. "Honey," Elise said, pinning a piece of midnight blue velvet. "We aren't doing mourning. We are doing regret. I want him to look at you and wonder if he hit his head." They settled on a gown that was pure architectural genius. It was a deep, shimmering emerald green, the color of money, ironically with a high slit and a back that plunged dangerously low. It was sophisticated, intimidating, and undeniably expensive. "Is he going to recognize you?" Elise asked, stepping back to admire her work. "I hope so," Fiona said. "But he's a narcissist. He only sees what he wants to see. He's expecting a victim. He won't know how to process a victor." Back in Chicago, Richard was preparing his own artillery. "I did some digging on the bride, Tiffany Dubois," Richard said over dinner that night. They were eating Thai food out of cartons, a habit they kept despite their success. "Let me guess," Fiona said. 24 years old, aspiring model. Close. 26, an influencer with a lot of bought followers. But here's the kicker." Richard leaned in. "Her father is Charles Dubois, the real estate mogul." Fiona paused her fork halfway to her mouth. "The Charles Dubois who owns the Dubois Hotel Group. The very same. We just signed a contract to redesign their flagship in Miami." Fiona realized, her eyes widening. "Does Brucey know?" "Brucey thinks he's marrying into money to save his failing logistics company," Richard explained. "He thinks marrying Tiffany secures him a partnership with her dad. But he doesn't know that you are the lead designer on Charles Dubois's biggest project of the decade." Fiona started to laugh. It started as a chuckle and turned into a full belly laugh. "So I'm basically Charles Dubois's favorite person right now, because I saved him $2 million on the lobby renovation." "Exactly," Richard smirked. "Brucey is marrying the daughter of your biggest client, and neither of them knows who you are." The stage was set. It wasn't just a wedding anymore. It was a collision of past lies and present truths. The day before the wedding, Fiona and Richard took a private jet to Rhode Island. They didn't post about it. They didn't check in on Facebook. They stayed at a boutique hotel downtown, avoiding the wedding block where Brucey and Tiffany were undoubtedly holding court. On the morning of the wedding, Fiona woke up with a knot in her stomach. Not fear. Adrenaline. "Ready?" Richard asked from the bathroom door. He was wearing a tuxedo that fit him like a glove, a James Bond vibe that made Brucey's flashy suits look cheap. Fiona stood up and smoothed the silk of her emerald dress. She put on the earrings, vintage sapphires, that she had bought herself for her 30th birthday. "He told me I was stagnant," Fiona whispered to herself in the mirror. "Let's see how much I've moved." "The car is downstairs," Richard said. "I upgraded us." "To what?" "You'll see." They went down to the lobby. Waiting at the curb wasn't just a car. It was a vintage Rolls-Royce Silver Cloud, polished to a mirror shine. It was the kind of car royalty arrived in. "Brucey likes to show off," Richard said, opening the door for her. "I thought we should speak his language." As they drove toward the Vanderbilt Hall, the landscape changed from town to sprawling estates. The ocean came into view grey and choppy. "There's one more thing," Richard said as they neared the venue. "What?" "I may have leaked a tip to the local society pages that a mystery VIP was attending the wedding. There might be photographers." Fiona looked at him shocked, then delighted. "You didn't." "He wanted a spectacle." Richard shrugged. "We're giving him one." The car slowed down. Ahead, the iron gates of the Vanderbilt Hall loomed. Security guards with clipboards were checking cars. Most of the guests were arriving in shuttles or rented sedans. The guard looked at the Rolls-Royce, his eyes widening. He didn't even check the list. He just waved them through to the VIP drop-off right in front of the steps. "Showtime," Fiona said. The gravel driveway of the Vanderbilt Hall was lined with guests who had just disembarked from the shuttle buses provided by the hotel. Brucey had insisted on shuttles for the regular guests to keep traffic down, reserving the front entrance for only the bridal party and the most elite VIPs. Brucey stood at the top of the grand limestone staircase, adjusting his cufflinks. They were gold engraved with his initials. He felt invincible. To his left stood his best man, a slick broker named Greg, who laughed too loud at Brucey's jokes. "Is she here yet?" Brucey asked, scanning the arriving crowd. He was looking for a beat-up Honda Civic, or perhaps a taxi dropping someone off at the main gate because they couldn't afford the valet fee. "Haven't seen her, man," Greg chuckled. "Maybe she got cold feet, or maybe she couldn't get the shift off at the diner." They both laughed. Brucey checked his Rolex. He wanted this moment. He needed Fiona to see the sheer scale of this venue. The Vanderbilt Hall was a Gilded Age mansion, a testament to old money, the kind of money Brucey was desperate to be associated with. He had stretched his company's credit line to the breaking point to rent this place just to prove he had made it. Suddenly, the chatter among the guests at the bottom of the stairs died down. Heads turned. A deep purring rumble echoed off the stone facade of the mansion. Slowly, majestically, the vintage Rolls-Royce Silver Cloud rolled around the fountain. The sunlight caught the polished chrome blindingly bright. It moved with the heavy grace of a tank dressed in a tuxedo. "Who is that?" Greg asked, squinting. "Is that Tiffany's dad?" "No." Brucey frowned. "Charles is already inside, screaming at the caterers about the wine. Maybe it's the venture capital guys from Boston." Brucey straightened his tie. If it was investors, he needed to look sharp. He took a step down the stairs, putting on his best CEO smile. The car came to a smooth halt right at the base of the red carpet. A valet scrambled to open the back door, but the driver, a uniformed chauffeur, beat him to it. The driver opened the rear door. First, a leg emerged. It wasn't the leg of a woman defeated by life. It was toned, tanned, and encased in a strappy, diamond-encrusted stiletto that cost more than Brucey's entire wedding tuxedo. Then Fiona stepped out. The silence that fell over the courtyard was absolute. The emerald green dress was a masterpiece. It hugged her frame like liquid determination, the velvet catching the light and shifting colors from deep forest to bright jade. The slit ran high, daring but elegant. Her hair, which she used to wear in a messy bun while grading papers, was now a sleek, glossy cascade of waves over one shoulder. Her makeup was flawless, highlighting eyes that looked sharper and colder than Brucey remembered. She didn't look like a substitute teacher. She looked like she owned the bank that held the mortgage on the building. And she wasn't alone. Richard stepped out from the other side, buttoning his tuxedo jacket. He was tall with salt and pepper hair and the easy, relaxed posture of a man who doesn't need to prove anything to anyone. He walked around the car, offered his arm to Fiona, and she took it. "Oh my God," a woman in the crowd whispered. It was Sarah, one of their old mutual friends who had sided with Brucey during the divorce. "Is that Fiona?" Brucey froze on the third step. His smile faltered, twitching at the corners. His brain couldn't process the image. This was a glitch in his reality. Fiona was supposed to be dowdy. She was supposed to look tired. She was supposed to be wearing something off the rack from a discount store. Fiona looked up. Her eyes locked onto Brucey's. She didn't smile. She didn't wave. She just held his gaze with a terrifying calmness. "Keep walking," Richard murmured to her, patting her hand on his arm. "Chin up. You're the Queen of England right now." "I feel more like the executioner," Fiona whispered back, a small smirk playing on her lips. They ascended the stairs. The crowd parted for them like the Red Sea. These were people who had ignored Fiona's texts 5 years ago. Now they were staring at her with a mix of jealousy and awe. As they reached the top of the stairs, Brucey found his voice. It was higher than usual. "Fiona." Fiona stopped. She looked him up and down, her expression mild, like she was inspecting a piece of fruit at the market that was slightly bruised. "Hello, Brucey," she said. Her voice was smooth, rich. "Congratulations." Brucey blinked. He looked at the car, which was pulling away, and then at Richard, and finally back at the diamonds dripping from Fiona's ears. I didn't think you'd come," Brucey stammered, completely off script. "You sent the invite," Fiona said, her tone light. "And you offered a free meal. Who am I to turn down charity?" The word charity hung in the air like a slap. She had taken his insult and worn it like armor. "And this is—" Brucey gestured aggressively at Richard, trying to regain control of the interaction. "Richard," Richard said, extending a hand. He didn't offer a last name. He didn't offer a title. He just shook Brucey's hand with a grip that was firm and crushing. "Old friend of Fiona's." "Right," Brucey scoffed, pulling his hand away quickly. "Well, the bar is inside. Don't drink too much, it's an open bar. But we don't want a scene." It was a weak jab, a pathetic attempt to remind her of the mess he claimed she was. Fiona leaned in just an inch. "Don't worry, Brucey. I only drink the good stuff. I assume you sprung for the top shelf." Before he could answer, she swept past him, the train of her velvet dress brushing against his polished shoes. Brucey stood there, stunned, as the scent of her perfume, santal and wild jasmine, drifted over him. It was the smell of money. "Dude," Greg whispered, leaning into Brucey. "That is your ex-wife. You said she was a troll." Brucey gritted his teeth, his face turning a shade of red that clashed with the brickwork. "She rented the car," he hissed. "It's a rental. It has to be. She's faking it." But deep down in the pit of his stomach, Brucey felt the first tremor of fear. The reception hall was breathtaking, a cavernous ballroom with high ceilings and crystal chandeliers. However, Fiona's trained eye immediately spotted the corners Brucey had cut. The flowers were mostly filler greenery, with very few actual blooms. The tablecloths were polyester, not linen, and the champagne being passed around by the waiters was a domestic, sparkling wine, not the French vintage implied by the label. "Cheap," Fiona murmured, taking a glass and taking a tiny sip before wrinkling her nose. "Acidic." "He's over-leveraged," Richard reminded her, grabbing a glass of sparkling water instead. "He spent all the money on the venue rental to look important and had nothing left for the experience. It's a classic rookie mistake." They stood near a marble pillar observing the room. Guests were whispering, pointing at Fiona. She ignored them, admiring the architecture of the ceiling. "Fiona." The voice was shrill. Fiona turned to see a young woman approaching. It was Tiffany, the bride. Tiffany was beautiful in a conventional Instagram filter sort of way. Her dress was massive, a ball gown that took up 3 feet of space in every direction, covered in sequins. She looked like a princess cake, but her face was pinched with annoyance. She had clearly just been briefed by Brucey. "I'm Tiffany," she said, not offering a hand. She held her bouquet like a weapon. "Brucey told me you were here." "The bride," Fiona said, smiling politely. "You look lovely, Tiffany. The dress is very big." Tiffany narrowed her eyes. "Brucey said you were a teacher, a substitute." She looked Fiona up and down, her eyes lingering on the emerald velvet. "Did you spend your whole year's salary on that dress? It's a bit dramatic for a wedding, don't you think? Trying to upstage the bride?" "I wouldn't dream of it," Fiona lied smoothly. "This is just something old I had in the back of my closet." Richard coughed to cover a laugh. The dress was literally weeks old and custom-made in Paris. "Well," Tiffany huffed, flipping her long blonde extensions. "I hope you enjoy the food. My father paid for the catering. It's top tier. I know Brucey felt bad for you being alone and struggling. He has such a big heart inviting charity cases." Fiona felt a flare of anger, not at the girl, but at Brucey for feeding this young woman such poison. "He certainly has a heart," Fiona said cryptically. "Make sure you keep a close eye on it. It tends to wander." Tiffany's eyes widened, her insecurity flaring. But before she could snap back, Brucey appeared, sliding an arm around Tiffany's waist. He had regrouped. He had a glass of whiskey in his hand and a fake smile plastered on his face. "Everything okay here, ladies?" he asked, his voice booming. He looked at Richard. "So, Richard, what do you do? Drive the limo?" It was a clumsy insult. Richard smiled, unbothered. "I work in finance, mostly," Richard said vaguely. "Helping businesses avoid bankruptcy, restructuring, that sort of thing." Brucey laughed, a barking sound. "Boring, I'm in logistics, tech-driven supply chain management. Sterling Logistics. We're about to go public next year. You've probably heard of us." "I have," Richard said, his eyes twinkling with a dangerous intelligence. "I read your Q3 report. Interesting numbers regarding your debt-to-equity ratio." Brucey's smile froze. The Q3 report wasn't public. It was only shared with high-level investors and banks. "How would you—" Brucey started, but he was interrupted by a commotion at the front of the room. The DJ tapped his microphone. "Ladies and gentlemen, please take your seats for the entrance Of the father of the bride. That's my dad. Tiffany beamed, forgetting her anger for a moment. He's the most important man in Rhode Island. Charles Dubois, Brucey said, puffing out his chest. We're practically partners. He's going to announce a huge investment in Sterling Logistics tonight, during the toast. That's the big surprise. Fiona and Richard exchanged a look. Is he now? Fiona asked softly. Oh, yes, Brucey gloated, leaning in close to Fiona's face, smelling of cheap whiskey. So take a good look, Fiona. This is what success looks like. I'm marrying into the Dubois empire. I'm going to be sitting at the head table. And you're at table 49, by the kitchen. Brucey, honey, let's go. Tiffany tugged on his arm. Daddy is coming in. Brucey gave Fiona one last sneer. Enjoy the free shrimp. Try not to stuff your purse. He walked away, guiding his massive bride toward the head table. Fiona stood still, her heart pounding against her ribs. Table 49, Fiona said, looking at the seating chart card in her hand. He really put us by the kitchen. We aren't going to sit at table 49, Richard said, checking his watch, because Charles Dubois is walking through those doors in about 30 seconds. And unless I'm mistaken, he has a very important question to ask his lead designer about the Miami project. You think he'll see me? Fiona asked. There are 300 people here. Fiona. Richard gestured to her dress. You are a green emerald in a sea of beige. He's going to see you. The doors swung open. Charles Dubois strode in. He was a large man, boisterous, wearing a tuxedo that actually fit. He waved to the crowd, shaking hands, looking every bit the billionaire tycoon. He began making his way toward the head table, where Brucey and Tiffany were waiting like eager puppies. Brucey was practically vibrating with excitement. He stood up, buttoning his jacket, ready to embrace his new father-in-law and seal his financial destiny. But halfway to the head table, Charles stopped. He frowned. He squinted. He looked past the cheering guests, past the centerpieces. His eyes locked onto the woman in the green dress, standing near the pillar. Charles Dubois' face lit up with a genuine, massive smile, a smile he hadn't shown anyone else all day. He completely changed direction, ignoring the head table, ignoring his daughter, and ignoring Brucey. He walked straight toward Fiona. Brucey watched, confused. Where is he going? The bathroom is the other way. The entire room went quiet as the billionaire marched up to the charity case, ex-wife. Fiona, Charles bellowed, opening his arms wide. My genius. What on earth are you doing here? Fiona smiled, stepping forward to accept the hug. Hello, Charles. I didn't want to miss the big day. Brucey dropped his whiskey glass. It shattered on the floor, but no one noticed. All eyes were on the billionaire hugging the woman Brucey had just tried to humiliate. The twist, Richard whispered to himself, taking a sip of his water, is about to begin. The shattering of the whiskey glass seemed to snap Brucey out of his trance. He signaled frantically to a waiter to clean up the mess, his face flushing a deep, mottled crimson. Charles, Brucey said, forcing a laugh that sounded more like a cough. He stepped around the shards of glass, extending a hand toward his father-in-law. I see you've met, Fiona. She's an old acquaintance from my struggling days. I invited her out of pity. You know how I am always giving back to the community. Charles Dubois ignored Brucey's outstretched hand. He turned slowly, his eyes narrowing, as he looked from the sweating groom to the poised woman in the emerald dress. Pity. Charles repeated the word, rolling off his tongue like a stone. You invited Fiona Mitchell out of pity. Brucey blinked. Mitchell? No, her name is Fiona Sterling. Well, used to be. She's a substitute teacher. Charles threw his head back and laughed, a booming baritone sound that echoed through the silent ballroom. Brucey, you fool. Charles wiped a tear from his eye. This is Fiona Mitchell, the founder and principal architect of Mitchell & Co., the woman who just redesigned the entire atrium of the Dubois Grand in Miami. The woman who saved me $3 million in structural retrofitting because she noticed a flaw in the original blueprints that your recommended contractors missed. The color drained from Brucey's face so fast it looked like he was about to faint. She... What? Brucey squeaked. She's the most sought-after design consultant on the East Coast right now. Charles beamed, patting Fiona on the shoulder. I've been trying to get her on a retainer for 6 months, and you're telling me you invited her here for a free meal. Fiona smiled, a sharp, dangerous expression. He did say I looked hungry, Charles. Charles scoffed. Ridiculous. Absolutely ridiculous. He turned to the head waiter, who was hovering nearby, terrified. Change of plans. Set a place for Ms. Mitchell and her associate at the head table, right next to me. Brucey's jaw dropped. Charles, you can't be serious. The head table is for family and the bridal party only. That's the protocol. My mother is sitting there. It's my money paying for the lobsters, Brucey. Charles said, his voice dropping to a low, menacing growl that only the immediate circle could hear. If I want to sit next to the only person in this room with a shred of artistic integrity, I will. Move your best man. Put him at table 49. Brucey looked at Greg, his best man. Greg, who had heard everything, simply held up his hands and backed away. I'm good, man. I'll go find the bar. And just like that, the hierarchy of the wedding shifted. Fiona and Richard were ushered to the dais. The guests watched in confusion and awe as the mystery woman in green ascended the platform. Brucey was forced to sit on the far end next to his weeping mother, who was complaining about the draft. Tiffany sat in the middle, looking confused, while Charles sat firmly between Tiffany and Fiona, turning his back on the groom entirely. Dinner was served. It was a lavish affair, filet mignon and lobster tail, but to Brucey it tasted like ash. He sat there, sawing at his steak, straining to hear the conversation happening 3 seats away. So the skylights, Charles was saying, pouring vintage wine into Fiona's glass himself, a bottle he had clearly ordered, specially not the swill being served to the rest of the room. You think we should go with the polarized glass? Absolutely, Fiona replied, her voice carrying effortlessly. Given the UV index in Miami, if you don't use polarized, you'll fade the tapestries in the lobby within 2 years. It's an upfront cost, but it saves you $50,000 in replacement costs down the line. Brilliant, Charles murmured. See, this is what I'm talking about. Vision. He turned to Tiffany. Tiffany, darling, you should listen to this woman. She's a self-made powerhouse, unlike some people who rely on loans. He shot a glance sideways at Brucey. Brucey choked on a piece of lobster. Richard, sitting on the other side of Fiona, leaned forward. He caught Brucey's eye and raised his glass in a mock toast. Brucey glared back, his hands shaking under the table. He felt like he was in a nightmare. This was supposed to be his coronation. He was supposed to be the king of the evening, bestowing charity on his peasant ex-wife. Instead, he was the court jester. So, Richard, Brucey called out, his voice too loud, desperate, to interrupt the love fest happening between his father-in-law and his ex-wife. Charles tells me you're in finance. Who do you work for? Maybe I know them. I know all the big players." The table went quiet. Richard set his fork down. He dabbed his mouth with a linen napkin. "I don't work for anyone, Brucey," Richard said calmly. "I own a private equity audit firm, Vanguard Forensic Accounting." Brucey froze. He knew that name. Vanguard was the firm that big banks called in when they suspected corporate fraud or when a company was about to go belly up. They were the grim reapers of the corporate world. "We specialize in distressed assets," Richard continued, his eyes locking onto Brucey's, "and uncovering hidden liabilities in pre-merger acquisitions." Charles paused his fork, hovering halfway to his mouth. He looked at Richard, then at Brucey. A strange, calculating look crossed the billionaire's face. "Is that so?" Charles said slowly. "You do due diligence?" "Extensive due diligence," Richard confirmed. "Actually, Charles, I've been meaning to send you a white paper we wrote on the logistics sector. There's a lot of smoke and mirrors in that industry right now. Companies inflating their projected earnings to secure seed capital." Brucey felt sweat trickling down his back. They knew. Somehow they knew. "I'd love to read that," Charles said, his voice dropping a few degrees in temperature. "Perhaps we can discuss it after the speeches." Brucey slammed his hand on the table, making the silverware jump. "Okay, great chat. But I think it's time for toasts. The band is waiting." He stood up, desperate to seize control of the narrative before Richard could say another word. He needed to get Charles to the microphone. He needed the public announcement of the investment. Once it was said in public, Charles couldn't back out without losing face. "To the microphone," Brucey announced, grabbing a champagne flute. "Let's get this party started." Fiona watched him, her eyes cool and detached. She leaned over to Richard. "He's panicking," she whispered. "He should be," Richard replied. "The shark is in the water." The DJ lowered the music. A spotlight hit the center of the head table. Brucey stood up, adjusting his tie. He looked out at the sea of faces, 300 guests, half of whom were business connections he was trying to impress. "Thank you, everyone," Brucey began. His voice amplified through the speakers. "Thank you for coming to celebrate. Well, me. And Tiffany, of course." A few polite chuckles. "You know," Brucey continued, pacing with the microphone. "5 years ago, I was a nobody. I was stuck in a dead-end life with dead-end energy." He cast a quick, sneering glance at Fiona, but she didn't flinch. She simply took a sip of her wine, looking bored. "But I knew I was destined for more. I knew I had to cut the dead weight to fly. And look at me now." He gestured to the room, to the chandeliers, to the gold-leafed walls. "I built sterling logistics from the ground up, blood, sweat, and tears. And tonight I'm not just gaining a beautiful wife and Tiffany. You look expensive tonight, baby." Tiffany giggled nervously. "I'm gaining a family," Brucey said, pivoting to Charles. "Charles Dubois has been a mentor to me, a father figure, and I am so honored that tonight we are merging not just our families, but our visions. To the future, to the Dubois Sterling Empire." He raised his glass. The crowd clapped, though the applause was somewhat tepid. Brucey beamed, feeling the high of the attention. He handed the microphone to Charles. "And now," Brucey announced, "a few words from the man who made this all possible, my father-in-law, Charles Dubois." Brucey sat down, looking smugly at Fiona. "This is it," his eyes said. "Watch the money roll in." Charles stood up. He didn't smile. He adjusted his jacket. He didn't pick up a champagne glass. He picked up the microphone and held it with a heavy hand. "Thank you, Brucey," Charles said. His voice was deep, commanding silence instantly. "Weddings are interesting things." Charles began pacing slowly behind the table. "They are about unions, mergers, two things becoming one. But in business, as in marriage, the most important thing is transparency." Brucey nodded vigorously. "That's right, transparency." "I value honesty above all else," Charles continued. "When Brucey came to me and asked for my daughter's hand, he told me he was a man of wealth and stability. He showed me spreadsheets. He showed me projections." Charles paused. He looked down at Richard. "But sometimes," Charles said, his voice hardening, "projections are just fantasy. Tonight, Brucey expects me to announce a $10 million investment into Sterling Logistics." Brucey leaned forward, practically salivating. "I had the check written out this morning," Charles said. He reached into his tuxedo pocket and pulled out a slip of paper. Brucey's eyes widened. "But," Charles said, "during dinner I had a very interesting conversation, and it reminded me that I hadn't actually had my own team audit Brucey's Q3 financials. I took his word for it, which was a mistake." The room went deathly silent. Brucey's smile vanished. "I made a few calls while you were eating your salad, Brucey." Charles said, his tone conversational but lethal. "My CFO called the bank. It seems Sterling Logistics isn't just over-leveraged, it's insolvent. You have 3 lawsuits pending from vendors you haven't paid in 6 months. And that Porsche you drive, it's being repossessed on Monday." A gasp rippled through the crowd. Tiffany looked at Brucey, horror dawning on her face. "Brucey, is that true?" Brucey stood up, knocking his chair over. "Charles, this is not the place. We can talk about this later. That's bad data, my accountant." "Sit down," Charles roared. The sound system feedback screeched. Brucey collapsed back into his chair. "I don't invest in liars," Charles said, tearing the check in half. The sound was crisp and amplified by the mic. He tore it again and again, letting the confetti pieces fall onto the white tablecloth. "However," Charles continued, his voice returning to a calm, professional tone, "I do have capital to deploy, and I believe in rewarding talent, real talent, the kind of talent that builds something from nothing without stepping on people to get there." Charles turned his body toward Fiona. "Fiona," Charles said, "you've done incredible work for my hotels as a contractor, but I'm tired of renting your genius. I want to own the partnership." He reached into his other pocket and pulled out a different envelope. "I am officially offering Mitchell & Company the exclusive contract for all Dubois properties worldwide," Charles announced. "A 5-year contract, valued at $20 million. The room erupted, not in polite applause, but in genuine shock and excitement. Brucey looked at Fiona. His face was grey. $20 million, he whispered. Fiona stood up slowly. She didn't look triumphant. She looked regal. She took the microphone that Charles offered her. She looked at Brucey, who was slumped in his chair, a ruined man at his own wedding. She looked at Tiffany, who was crying into her napkin. She looked at the crowd who had judged her for years. "Thank you, Charles," Fiona said, her voice steady. "I accept, but on one condition." "Name it," Charles said. "The logistics for the renovation projects," Fiona said, locking eyes with Brucey. "I want full control over who we hire. No nepotism, no favors. We only hire companies that are solvent, companies that pay their debts." She paused, letting the words sink in. "Because," she added, "I know what it's like to be left with nothing. And I won't let my company work with anyone who creates that kind of wreckage." She handed the microphone back to Charles and sat down. Brucey put his head in his hands. Tiffany stood up. She looked at her father, then at her new husband. "You're broke," she screeched at Brucey. "You told me you were buying us a villa in Como. Tiffany, honey, it's just a cash flow issue," Brucey pleaded, reaching for her. "Don't touch me." She slapped his hand away. "Daddy, he lied to me." "I know Pumpkin," Charles said, putting an arm around his daughter. "Don't worry, the prenup is ironclad. We can annul this by Monday morning on the grounds of fraud." Brucey looked around the room. The guests were whispering, laughing, taking videos on their phones. He looked for an exit, but he was trapped at the head table center stage in his own destruction. Fiona picked up her glass of vintage wine, the real stuff this time. She turned to Richard. "I think I enjoyed the meal," she said. "The dessert," Richard grinned, "is going to be even better." The wedding reception didn't end with a sparkler exit or a romantic getaway car. It ended with the lights being turned up to full brightness, the ugly lights, as the staff called them, signaling that the party was over before the cake was even cut. Brucey sat alone at the head table. The white tablecloth was stained with spilled wine and littered with the confetti remains of the check Charles had torn up. Tiffany had left 20 minutes ago. She had stormed out, her massive dress knocking over a flower arrangement on her way, followed closely by her father, who was already on the phone with his legal team, drafting the annulment papers. Most of the guests, sensing the radioactive levels of awkwardness, had slipped away. Only the staff remained clearing plates and looking at Brucey with a mixture of pity and annoyance. "Excuse me, sir." Brucey looked up. It was the venue manager, a stern woman with a clipboard. "Miss Sterling?" she asked. "Yes," Brucey croaked. His throat was dry. He needed a drink, but the bar had closed the moment Charles walked out. "Since Mr. Dubois has departed and informed us that the direct billing authorization has been revoked," she said, tapping her pen on the invoice. "We need to settle the balance for the evening. The food, the venue rental, the open bar, the security." Brucey blinked. "Put it on my corporate card." "We tried, sir," the manager said, her face impassive. "It was declined. Card suspended was the error message." Brucey felt the blood drain from his extremities. The bank. They had moved fast. If Charles's CFO had called them, they must have frozen his accounts immediately, pending an investigation into his solvency. I can write a check," Brucey stammered, patting his pockets. "We require a cashier's check or a wire transfer for amounts over $10,000, sir. The total is $85,000. Brucey stared at her. He didn't have 85 cents, let alone $85,000. From the shadows near the exit, Fiona and Richard watched. They hadn't left yet. Fiona wanted to see this. She needed to see this. "He's stuck with the bill," Richard noted, buttoning his tuxedo jacket against the evening chill coming from the open doors. "He wanted to be the big man," Fiona said softly. "He wanted the credit. Now he has the debt." Fiona walked back toward the table. Her heels clicked on the marble floor, echoing in the empty hall. Brucey looked up. When he saw her, a flicker of hope crossed his face. It was pathetic. "Fiona," he breathed. "Fiona, please. You have money now. You just got that contract. You have to help me. For old time's sake. I'll pay you back. I swear." Fiona stopped in front of him. She looked down at the man who had once been her world, the man who had made her feel small so he could feel big. "For old time's sake," Fiona repeated. She tilted her head. "Brucey, do you remember the day you left? Do you remember what I asked you for?" Brucey swallowed hard. You asked for next month's rent, just to get by until you found a job." "And do you remember what you said?" Brucey looked down at his shoes. "You said..." Fiona continued, her voice hard as diamond. That struggle builds character. You said giving me money would only enable my mediocrity. She reached into her small beaded clutch. Brucey's eyes followed her hand. Was she getting a checkbook? Cash? Fiona pulled out a single quarter. 25 cents. She placed it on the table next to his hand. Call someone who cares, Fiona said. If you can find one. She turned on her heel, the emerald velvet swirling around her legs, and walked away. Fiona, Brucey screamed after her, his voice cracking. You can't leave me here. They're going to call the police. That sounds like a logistical problem, Brucey. She called back without looking. I'm sure you'll figure it out. Richard offered her his arm at the door. They walked out into the cool night air, leaving Brucey Sterling alone in the ruins of his own ego. 6 months later, the collapse of Sterling Logistics was swift and brutal. It became a case study in business schools on the dangers of over-leveraging and corporate fraud. It turned out Brucey had been cooking the books for years, using new loans to pay off old interest, a classic Ponzi scheme structure wrapped in tech buzzwords. Tiffany Dubois granted an exclusive interview to Vanity Fair titled The Bride Who Escaped. She painted herself as the victim of a master manipulator. Her follower count tripled. She was currently dating a European soccer player, and Fiona. Fiona stood on the balcony of the newly renovated Dubois Grand in Miami. The sun was setting, casting a golden glow over the ocean. The polarized skylights, her idea, were gleaming above, perfect and functional. Champagne. Richard walked out onto the balcony, holding 2 flutes. This time it was Dom Perignon. To the grand opening? Fiona smiled, taking the glass. To the grand opening, Richard toasted. And to the $20 million bonus. They clinked glasses. You know, Richard said, leaning against the railing. I ordered something online the other day. Some new drafting pens. Oh. Fiona looked at him. Why are you telling me this? Because of the delivery guy. Richard smirked. He was in a rush, sweaty, looked miserable. He dropped the package, cursed, and ran back to his truck. Fiona raised an eyebrow. And it was Brucey. Fiona froze. She looked at Richard to see if he was joking. He wasn't. He's driving for a courier service, third-party contractor. Richard nodded. Minimum wage, no benefits. He's actually working in logistics now, moving boxes from point A to point B. Fiona looked out at the horizon. She thought she would feel a surge of joy, or perhaps a vindictive thrill. But she didn't. She felt nothing. The anger was gone. The hurt was gone. Brucey was just a ghost, a cautionary tale that had ceased to be relevant to her story. Well, Fiona took a sip of her champagne. I hope he's efficient. I'd hate for my pens to be late. Richard laughed, a warm sound that mixed with the ocean breeze. So, he said, moving a little closer, now that the Miami project is done, Charles is talking about a resort in the Maldives. He needs a lead architect, and I believe the contract requires a site visit. The Maldives. Fiona smiled, looking at him. That sounds like a lot of work. We could make time for a vacation, Richard suggested softly. Fiona looked at the man who had stood by her when she had nothing, who had helped her build an empire and who had driven a getaway car from the wedding of the century. I think, Fiona said, I'd like that very much. She turned back to the view, the emerald green of the ocean, matching the memory of the dress that changed everything. She wasn't the substitute teacher anymore. She wasn't the stagnant wife. She was Fiona Mitchell, and she had finally arrived And that, ladies and gentlemen, is the story of how Brucey invited his poor ex-wife to his wedding to disgrace her, only to find out that she was the one holding the keys to his future. He wanted to show her how far he had come, but all he did was show the world how far he had fallen. It's a powerful reminder. Never underestimate the person you left behind, and never ever mistake kindness for weakness. Brucey thought success was about flash and noise, but Fiona proved that real power moves in silence, and sometimes in a vintage Rolls-Royce. Brucey ended up exactly where he started, struggling and alone, while Fiona built a life based on talent, integrity, and a little bit of well-placed revenge. What do you think? Did Brucey deserve his fate, or was Fiona too harsh? And what would you do if your ex invited you to their wedding just to show off? Would you go? Let me know in the comments below. If you enjoyed this story of karma served, ice cold, please smash that like button. It really helps the channel grow. Don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell so you never miss a story. Share this video with a friend who needs a reminder that the best revenge is massive success. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.